Have you ever lived beside something dangerous without realizing it? That question kept echoing in my mind as I stood in the garage, the sudden blackout plunging our home into unnatural silence. The storm outside had knocked out the power, and with it, the usual hum of refrigerators, lights, and electronics faded until all I could hear was the soft tapping of rain against the window panes. The air was heavy and warm from the storm, contrasting sharply with the cold concrete floor beneath my bare feet. It was a strange feeling. The house felt different, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I had come out here expecting nothing more than to check the fuse box or grab a flashlight. But then the smell hit me. It was sharp, metallic, and sour, a scent so foreign and out of place that I immediately thought it had to be a mistake. I sniffed again, trying to locate it. It was coming from the corner of the garage where the old freezer sat, the one my husband always kept locked tight. He called it his meat and supplies storage, claiming it was full of things he didn't want thawing by accident. I had never questioned it because every time I got close, his reaction was too intense, his warnings too firm. I learned early on to stay away, to never ask what was inside. But now, in the dark with the power out, that freezer seemed to cast a shadow far darker than the night itself. The smell grew stronger as I moved closer, a sickening odor that clawed at my senses. I looked down at my hand trembling, then slowly reaching out, my fingers brushing the cold metal lid. I knew this was crossing a line I'd never dared to cross before. The years of hesitation, confusion, and silent fear all crashed down in that moment. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding louder than the storm outside. Whatever was inside that freezer wasn't just frozen food or supplies. It had been living under my roof, hidden in plain sight, and I was about to find out the truth. My hand tightened on the lid, and I hesitated, caught between the fear of what I might see and the need to finally understand what my husband had been hiding all these years. The cold air escaped as I lifted the freezer lid, the faint hum of the old appliance suddenly feeling like a scream in the quiet kitchen. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic and old newspaper, lay something that didn't belong here, a box worn and out of place, its edges softened by time. My breath caught in my throat as I reached in, fingers trembling, heart still racing as if it wanted to leap from my chest. What secrets had been kept frozen all this time? What weight had my husband been carrying alone? In moments like this, when the past and present collide so violently, it's hard not to feel overwhelmed. And I know I'm not alone. Everyone watching this has probably faced a moment where the truth hits harder than expected. If this story resonates with you, or if you've ever had to confront something hidden in your life, I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments what part of this story touched you most, or tell me about your own experience with secrets that changed everything. It's these exchanges, these connections, that turn a simple video into a community, a space where we can find strength and understanding in each other's stories. And if you're finding value in this journey, maybe hit that like button. It really helps this message reach more people who might be going through something similar, people who need to know they're not alone. Every comment, every like, every new subscriber is a vital thread in the fabric of this channel. It's what keeps this story alive and growing, allowing us to explore these moments together. So if you want to keep following along, to unravel more layers and discover what happens next, subscribing means you won't miss a beat. This isn't just about me sharing a story, it's about us building something meaningful here. Your voice matters, your presence matters. Let's keep this conversation going. Because sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that bring us closer, not just to the people around us, but to ourselves. And now, as I finally prepare to open that box, I realize this moment is just the beginning. At first, the rules about the freezer in the garage seemed almost trivial. My husband insisted I never open it. He said the food inside could get messed up if I disturbed the order he kept, or that the tools stored in one compartment might be dangerous if handled improperly. He wasn't overtly hostile about it, more like firm, like this was an unspoken boundary we just didn't cross. I remember him always keeping the key on a separate ring, hanging it from his belt or slipping it into a pocket only he reached into. It was a small detail, but it stuck out because everything else in the house was so accessible. Whenever I came near the freezer, he would subtly position himself between me and it. Sometimes he'd be standing in the garage, casually doing something, but always angling his body so I couldn't get close without him noticing. It wasn't aggressive, but there was a definite shift in his demeanor that went beyond what you'd expect if someone was just protecting their personal space. If I asked about the freezer, his tone changed. It became quieter, clipped, almost defensive. He'd say things like, "It's just meat," or "It's just tools," as if trying to downplay the whole thing. I never pressed him further because I felt like I was crossing a line just by asking. At the time, I accepted these rules as harmless habits, part of his way of keeping things organized. I figured maybe he had a system in the garage that I wasn't familiar with, and that was fine. I didn't want to cause unnecessary tension over something so small. I thought he just wanted things done a certain way, and I respected that. It was easier to let it go than to make a fuss about a locked freezer. Looking back, I realized those moments were early warning signs. The way he guarded the freezer wasn't just about the contents inside, it was about control. The separate keyring, the way he stood between me and the freezer, the sudden change in his voice when I tried to ask questions, all of it pointed to something deeper. At the time, I was confused. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than a quirk, but now I understand that those small shifts were the first cracks showing in the trust between us. It's strange how easy it was to overlook. When you're close to someone, you tend to explain away behaviors that don't quite fit, especially when the explanations sound harmless. I told myself he just liked things a certain way, that the freezer was his domain and I was just stepping into it too often. But now I see that these were early boundaries being drawn, boundaries that I wasn't meant to cross. At the time, I accepted it because the alternative, questioning why he needed to control even the smallest parts of our shared space, felt uncomfortable, even frightening. The freezer became a symbol of those early restrictions. It wasn't just about food or tools. It was about the way he began to establish power in small, almost invisible ways. And I chose to ignore it because the truth was hard to face. The more I accepted those rules without question, the more I unknowingly gave him space to push further. I didn't realize then how those early habits would shape everything that came after. I remember the nights when I thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. The house was quiet except for the faint sounds coming from the garage. There was a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged or shifted across the concrete floor. Sometimes it was accompanied by a dull thud or a quiet clink, like metal hitting metal. I never got up to check because I told myself it was nothing important. Maybe he was moving something around, organizing the tools or fixing something. I convinced myself these noises were just the usual sounds of a busy garage. Over time, I noticed the freezer in the corner of the garage had new locks. At first, it was strange because I didn't remember when they appeared. One day there was just a simple latch, and the next, there was a padlock with a small keyhole. Then, another lock showed up, more complex, harder to open. I asked him once about it, trying to sound casual, and he said he was just being careful. He said he didn't want anyone messing with the freezer because it had some special items inside, things he wanted to keep safe. I didn't press him for details. I told myself he had the right to protect his stuff, that it wasn't anything to worry about. It was his space. I also started noticing tools disappearing. A wrench here, a screwdriver there. I'd look for something I needed, and it wouldn't be where I left it. When I asked him, he always had an excuse. I borrowed it for a project, he'd say. I put it in a different drawer. Sometimes he said he'd taken them outside for some repairs or given them to a friend for a quick job. I didn't want to get upset over missing tools. It seemed easier to accept his explanations than to question him. I figured he just liked things his way and that was fine. When we had guests over, his behavior around the garage changed. He would stay close to the door leading to the garage, almost like a guard. If anyone wandered near, he got visibly tense. His eyes followed every movement near that corner. If a friend or family member tried to peek inside or asked about the freezer, he quickly shut down the conversation or changed the subject. Sometimes he'd even walk over and close the garage door, saying it was too cold or that there were hazardous materials inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought maybe he was just shy or didn't want to embarrass himself with the state of the garage. I told myself he was simply protective of his belongings. Maybe he had some embarrassing clutter or broken things he didn't want anyone to see. I convinced myself that his need for control was about privacy, not something darker. It felt more comfortable to believe that than to imagine there might be something wrong. I thought if I challenged him or asked too many questions, it would cause unnecessary conflict. So, I kept quiet. I accepted those small signs as quirks, as parts of who he was. Looking back now, I realize those noises, the locks, the missing tools, and his guarded behavior weren't just quirks. They were warnings I ignored. I was uncomfortable with the way he kept the freezer off limits, but I told myself it wasn't my business. I was uneasy when I heard scraping in the dead of night, but I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Those excuses were easy to make then. Now, I see they were ways I avoided facing a deeper truth, one I wasn't ready to confront at the time. The moment the front door clicked shut behind him, everything in the house seemed to freeze along with me. I stood in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly too loud, the shadows stretching like fingers across the linoleum floor. He was there, my husband, but not the man I knew. He was shaking, his body trembling so violently it was almost painful to watch. His clothes were streaked with dirt, smudged and dark, as if he'd crawled through some patch of earth or mud. I noticed the scratches on his forearms, red, angry lines that hadn't been there before, and the mud that clung stubbornly to his shoes, leaving a trail behind him. He didn't look at me. Not once. His eyes were fixed on the floor, and when he moved, it wasn't with the usual ease or warmth I'd come to expect. His breath came in ragged, heavy gasps, like he'd been running for miles, though he hadn't spoken a word since stepping in. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and chaotic in the suffocating silence. I wanted to ask him what happened, to reach out and pull him close, but something held me frozen in place, a creeping, growing dread that whispered I shouldn't intervene yet. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the garage. His hands, still shaking, fumbled with the keys dangling from his belt. I followed silently, my footsteps hesitant, every muscle wound tight with anxiety. The garage smelled cold and stale, mixed with the faint metallic tang of oil and concrete. He moved to the freezer, the one I'd never been allowed to open, the one that had become a silent boundary between us. His fingers trembled as he unlocked it, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly loud in the empty space. I watched, breath caught in my throat, as he opened the door and reached inside. His movements were careful but urgent, as if he was afraid of what might happen if he hesitated. He pulled something out, or maybe put something in, I couldn't tell in the dim light. The shape was indistinct, wrapped tightly in a plastic bag that crinkled softly. His hands were slick with sweat, and I saw the tension ripple across his arms with every shiver that racked his frame. Then, almost as quickly as it began, he locked the freezer again. The sound of the lock closing felt like a final, irrevocable seal. He leaned against the wall, shoulders heaving, chest rising and falling so rapidly it was like he was trying to suck in enough air to drown out whatever storm was raging inside him. He still didn't meet my eyes, and I realized the truth with a cold, sinking certainty. He wasn't just hiding objects in that freezer. He was hiding something far darker, something that went beyond possessions. My hands clenched at my sides, knuckles white, as a wave of fear crashed over me. This wasn't about secrecy or mistrust anymore, it was about survival, about something dangerous that had slipped into our lives and was now lurking just beneath the surface. The man I loved was a stranger, shrouded in silence and shadows, and I was standing on the edge of a terrifying unknown. The air between us crackled with unspoken truths, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I just stood there, watching him tremble and breathe hard, the dread tightening its grip around my heart. That night marked a turning point. The moment I realized the freezer wasn't just a locked box in the garage, it was a guardian of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud, and my husband was the keeper of something I wasn't prepared to face. The garage was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator running somewhere beyond the door. My heart thudded in my chest so loudly I thought it might give me away. He wasn't home. For the first time in weeks, I had the house to myself, and that meant I could finally try. I crept toward the freezer, every nerve on edge, every step measured and cautious. The cold metal surface of the freezer pressed against my palm, shocking me with its chill, making me pull back for a second. I forced my hand down again, steadying my breath. The padlock was heavy, solid, and cold against my fingers. I traced the thick metal with trembling hands, feeling the weight and the unyielding firmness of it. There was no give, no slack. The lock was older than I thought, the metal dulled and worn in places, but it still held firm. My fingers sought any flaw, any weakness, but found none. The metal was rough under my fingertips, with tiny scratches and dents from years of use. The cold made my skin sting, and I pulled my hand back, trying to warm it against my jeans. A faint smell floated around the freezer, something metallic and faintly sour, like rust mixed with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange enough to make me wrinkle my nose. It reminded me of medicine cabinets or old hospital rooms, sterile but not clean. The smell made the entire moment feel heavier, like the air in the garage had thickened, pressing down on my chest. I glanced quickly toward the door, my eyes darting to the hallway beyond the garage. What if he came home early? What if he heard me? My breath caught as I imagined the worst, his voice sharp and angry, footsteps pounding on the floor, the world collapsing around me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands, but the fear wrapped around me like a tight rope, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried to lift the lid gently, careful not to make a sound. The padlock held fast, the thick metal chain unyielding. I pushed against it, but the lock didn't move an inch. My fingers slipped on the cold metal, and I bit my lip, fighting the urge to pull away and run. I wanted to know what was inside, to face whatever secrets it held, but the lock was a barrier I couldn't cross. The coldness of the metal had seeped into my bones, making me shiver despite the summer heat outside. Every second stretched out painfully long. I kept glancing back at the door, my heart hammering louder with each passing moment. The silence was deafening. The garage smelled faintly of oil and dust, mixed with a strange metallic scent that seemed to cling to the freezer. My palms were sweaty despite the chill, and I wiped them nervously on my pants. I didn't open it that day. I couldn't. The lock was too strong, and the fear too overwhelming. But the moment settled deep inside me, a heavy weight that refused to lift. Even after I backed away, my hands still tingled from the cold, and the smell lingered in my nose. The fear stayed with me for weeks, an invisible chain wrapped tightly around my chest every time I thought about that frozen box and the secrets it held. At first, the smell was so faint I wondered if it was just my imagination. On the warmest days, when the sun hit the garage just right, a subtle metallic tang would drift from the freezer's direction, something sour and sharp, like copper mixed with a faint trace of ammonia. It was never strong enough to pinpoint immediately, more like an echo in the back of my throat or a whisper hovering just at the edge of my senses. I'd pause, tilt my head, trying to catch it again, but by the time I turned back, it was gone. I mentioned it once, casually, hoping he'd notice too. "Do you smell that? Like metal or something?" I asked, glancing toward the freezer door. He waved it off without much thought. "Probably just something spoiled in the trash," he said, his voice low and certain. "Or maybe one of those old cans in the back of the fridge leaking." It was his typical way of deflecting concerns, practical, dismissive, like I was making mountains out of molehills. But the smell didn't disappear. Over the next few days, it crept back, a little stronger each time. It wasn't just the freezer anymore. The air near the garage door sometimes held it too, mingling with the dampness that always settled there. I started cleaning obsessively, wiping down shelves, taking out every last crumb and forgotten bottle. I even dragged the trash cans out for extra scrubbing. He'd shake his head, telling me I was making a big deal out of nothing, but I could tell he was uneasy too, though he never said it aloud. I found myself avoiding that side of the house. Walking past the garage door became an exercise in holding my breath, my steps quickening as the sour metallic odor teased my nostrils. It was like the smell had a weight, pressing down on me, a subtle nausea that would flare up when I lingered too long. Sometimes, when I opened the kitchen door that led to the garage, the scent would slip inside, faint but unmistakable. It was impossible to ignore, even when I tried. One afternoon, I caught him sniffing near the freezer, his face tight with something I couldn't quite name. "It's just the heat," he muttered when I asked if he smelled it too. "Must have caused some packaging to go bad or something." But even as he said it, I saw the way his eyes darted to the floor, how his jaw clenched. That alone made the hairs on my arms stand up. The smell began to spread beyond the garage's threshold. It seeped into the kitchen, threading through the cracks beneath the cabinets, settling into the corners of the living room. On some mornings, the air felt heavier, thick with that same sour metallic scent that now clung stubbornly to my clothes. I started opening windows, lighting candles, anything to mask it, but nothing worked. The odor was persistent, invasive, like a cold shadow hovering just out of sight but impossible to shake. At night, when the house was still and quiet, I could almost hear it, an invisible pulse, a low hum carried by the stale air, reminding me that whatever was hidden behind that freezer wasn't just a forgotten box or spoiled food. Something was seriously wrong, and I was running out of reasons to believe otherwise. The smell wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was a warning, an omen I couldn't afford to ignore. Every breath drawn felt heavier, laden with dread I couldn't name but couldn't escape either. The storm had been creeping closer all evening. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the window panes in a slow, steady rhythm that grew louder with every minute. The sky, once a dull gray, darkened to a heavy black, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the clouds in sharp, brief bursts. The air felt thick and heavy, charged with tension, like something was waiting to break loose. Inside the house, the lights started to flicker. First, it was subtle, just a slight dimming, enough to make the shadows in the corners stretch a little longer. Then the bulbs blinked off and on, a stuttering rhythm that made my skin crawl. I stood still, watching the ceiling light above me pulse like a warning signal. The hum of the refrigerator fluctuated too, rising and falling unevenly, as if the appliances themselves were struggling to hold on. Then, in an instant, everything went black. The power cut out without warning. The house fell into a silence so complete that it felt unnatural. No hum from the fridge, no buzzing of the lights, no background noise at all. Even the usual creaks and groans of settling would seem to vanish. It was like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood frozen for a moment, my ears straining to catch any sound beyond my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. I reached out blindly, fingers brushing against the wall until I found the light switch. No use. Darkness pressed in from all sides. I took a slow breath, the air thick and stale, and moved toward the garage door. The storm's noise was muffled now, but I could still hear the distant rumble of thunder, low and rolling. Stepping into the garage, the change was immediate. The usual background noise of the freezer motor was gone, and the silence seemed deeper, heavier. The smell hit me right away, sharp and unmistakable. It was stronger now, more pungent, like something rotting just beneath the surface. The freezer's motor had masked it before, blending it into the background, but without that mechanical drone, the odor filled the space and pressed against my nostrils. The darkness made everything feel closer, tighter. I could sense the walls leaning in, the cold concrete floor under my feet, and my own breath, loud and uneven in the quiet. I moved slowly, hand extended, guiding myself along the garage wall toward the freezer. My fingers brushed the cold metal, the surface slick with condensation. The handle was just ahead. I hesitated. For years, I had never dared approach this spot alone, not without him watching, not without his warning eyes fixed on me. But tonight, the house was silent, empty of his presence. The blackout had given me something I hadn't had in a long time: privacy. A part of me wanted to run, to get as far away as possible, but another part pressed forward, driven by a gnawing need to know what was inside. The urgency was there, raw and urgent, like a ticking clock counting down the moments before the power would flicker back on and the noise would return, along with him. I gripped the freezer handle, cold and unyielding in my hand. My fingers trembled as I pulled it open. The lid creaked slightly, breaking the silence, and a rush of cold air spilled out, biting at my skin. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, filling my lungs with its sour metallic edge. I leaned closer, eyes adjusting to the darkness, trying to make out shapes inside the freezer. The cold was sharp, but it wasn't just temperature. There was something else there, something that made my skin prickle and my heart race faster. I stayed there, frozen between fear and curiosity, knowing that whatever I was about to see was no longer hidden by the hum of a motor or the glow of a light. It was completely exposed, and I couldn't turn away. The knock came sharply, 3 firm raps against the front door. My heart jumped in my chest, a sudden rush of adrenaline that made my hands tremble. I had been standing near the garage entrance, the smell still thick in the air, but now I had no choice. The noise was real, unavoidable. Someone was here. I wiped my clammy palms on my jeans before moving to the door and unlocking it. 2 officers stood there, their uniforms neat but their expressions serious. One was a woman, her eyes scanning me carefully, while the man beside her took a cautious step forward, already catching a faint trace of the smell before entering. I swallowed hard, feeling exposed. I hadn't expected anyone to come, not like this, but now that they were here, the weight on my chest eased just a little. Maybe this was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment someone else could take over, handle what I couldn't. "Good evening, ma'am," the female officer said, her voice calm but direct. "We got a call from one of your neighbors. They mentioned a strong odor coming from this property. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, my voice barely above a whisper. I think something's wrong. The smell got worse after the blackout last night. It's been in the garage, and now it's so strong it's even leaking outside." The male officer nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "May we take a look inside? We want to make sure there's no danger." I stepped aside and motioned them in. The moment they crossed the threshold into the garage, their faces changed. The woman's brow furrowed deeply, and the man's nostrils flared as he inhaled sharply. Neither tried to hide their reaction. The air was heavy, thick with something I'd been trying to ignore for too long. "Do you live here with anyone else?" the female officer asked, her tone firm but not unkind. "My husband," I said, voice cracking. "But I don't know where he is. He hasn't come home in days." The man looked toward the freezer, then back at me. "Is that where the smell is coming from?" I nodded, unable to meet their eyes. "Yes. I think something inside it. I don't know. I haven't opened it since the blackout." The female officer exchanged a glance with her partner before turning back to me. "We're going to have to open it, ma'am. It's important we see what's inside." My chest tightened instantly, a sharp, cold pressure that made it hard to breathe. I felt like I was on the edge of falling apart, standing there with officers who were about to uncover something I had lived beside without truly seeing. Fear and relief tangled inside me. Fear of what we would find, relief that someone else was finally stepping in to take control. "I understand," I said, my voice barely steady. "Please, do whatever you need to." The male officer moved toward the freezer's latch, his hands careful but determined. The female officer pulled on gloves from her pocket, preparing for what might come next. I stayed frozen, every heartbeat loud in my ears, the smell growing heavier as the door started to open. In that moment, I realized I was seconds away from a truth I hadn't been ready to face, yet somehow, I was ready now. The officers didn't flinch, didn't look away. They were here to do their job, and I was no longer alone in this. As the freezer door swung open, the cold air rushed out, carrying with it the undeniable proof of everything I had feared but hadn't dared admit. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the officers' quiet, careful voices as they began to assess what lay inside. For the first time in a long time, something was moving forward. The truth was no longer buried in darkness. It was standing right there, in front of all of us. The padlock snapped open with a sharp metallic sound that seemed to echo louder than it should in the stillness of the room. I stood behind the officers, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The cold air hit my face the moment the lid was lifted, sharper and more biting than I expected. Even though I'd tried to prepare myself for this moment, the reality was something else entirely. Inside the freezer, there were boxes stacked unevenly, some wrapped in plastic bags, others left open. Pieces of clothing were folded or just thrown in, a mix of fabrics and colors that didn't belong to any of us. I reached out but stopped myself. I couldn't touch any of it yet. My hands trembled just watching. One officer crouched down, shining his flashlight over the contents. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he radioed in. The static crackled softly in the background, but his focus never wavered. Another officer pulled out a folded scarf, holding it carefully by the edges. I recognized it instantly, the same scarf I'd seen in the news, linked to a missing person. The sight of it made my legs go weak. I had to steady myself against the wall, my knees threatening to give way. I wanted to look away, to shut this all out, but my eyes stayed glued to the freezer's contents. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These weren't just forgotten belongings or random items. They were pieces of lives I didn't know, kept hidden here without explanation. It was impossible to ignore that fact. The officers spoke in quiet, clipped tones, no unnecessary words, just the facts. Their faces were serious, eyes sharp and unreadable. I caught myself watching their expressions, searching for some clue, some sign of what they thought. But all I saw was professional calm, like they had seen this kind of thing before and had learned to keep their distance emotionally. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. How had I missed this? How had I lived with him, shared my days and nights with someone who was hiding so much? The betrayal stung deeper than I expected, tighter than any pain I could name. It wasn't just the freezer or what was inside it, it was the fact that I had been so blind, so utterly unaware. The silence pressed down again, heavier now, as the officers began to carefully remove items, laying them out on a nearby table. I stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move. The air around me felt thick, charged with something I couldn't put into words. I realized then that this moment was a turning point. The truth was no longer something I could avoid or deny. It was real, tangible, and right in front of me. I swallowed hard, trying to hold back the rush of emotions that threatened to spill over. Anger, sorrow, confusion, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't unravel. The officers didn't look at me, but I knew they were aware of the weight of this moment, just as I was. And as the freezer door remained open behind them, I understood something crucial. My husband hadn't just been hiding things from me. He had been hiding pieces of other people's lives, and I had lived beside him without ever truly seeing. It's hard to put into words what it feels like to realize you've shared your life and your home with someone who carried such a hidden darkness. The shock doesn't fade quickly. It lingers, quiet, unsettling. I spent so long trying to make sense of what I missed, questioning every glance, every silence, every moment I thought I understood. But sometimes, understanding never comes the way you hope. Stories like mine aren't as rare as we'd like to believe. There are many people out there living right next to danger, wrapped in normalcy, unaware until everything falls apart. It's a quiet kind of fear, one that slips through the cracks because no one expects it. That's why sharing these stories matters, to remind you that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight. If you want to hear more about lives touched by this kind of hidden danger, stories where the line between safety and threat is blurred until it's almost impossible to tell, I invite you to subscribe to Under the Same Roof. This channel is a place where we listen closely to voices that reveal the unseen, the quiet struggles, and the complex truths behind these very human experiences. Before you go, please type "I'm still watching" in the comments. It's a simple way for me to know you stayed through this, to acknowledge the weight of what you just heard. It means more than you might think. Thank you for listening.